Welcome back to the Elite Performance Podcast. Today we have a special roundtable discussion with Korey Van Wyk and Shawn Myszka. We talk about our recent attendance at the Skill Acquisition in Arizona meeting by Rob Gray, a meeting that was put on with the idea and hopes to talk about skill acquisition and motor learning for coaches and how to make our athletes retain and transfer many of the skills that we work on in practice or training into the game. So we talk about different things like the constraints-led approach, dynamical correspondence, nonlinear pedagogy, and ecological psychology, and how some of those theories or approaches can help coaches structure better training or practices with those skills that we work on be better transferred or retained in the chaos and the stress of game. Because at the end of the day, all coaches and practitioners, our goal is to make our athletes better suited for the stresses and the demands of their sport. Not just be better in practice or not just be better in the weight room, but rather have everything that we work on be retained and transferred into the stress of sport, because that is what matters most to coaches and to the athletes. So great discussion with Shawn and Korey. I know you'll take away many of the things that we talked about. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to Shawn and Korey.
I haven't even gotten a chance to really go through and review and recap any of it yet, but
Yeah.
I know what's still fresh in my mind, and I'm interested to hear both of your accounts, maybe how you've started to use that to evolve and kind of guide your thought processes, and maybe what we don't know, and maybe we have a better, clear understanding of what we don't know. Kind of, Korey, to your point yesterday about what we may not know about baseball, those same types of things in regards to movement problems and movement solutions in our own respective sport domains and disciplines, we also don't have that information on in many cases. So I think that's maybe the biggest thing that I took from things last weekend, and would love to discuss with you guys as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can get rocking right now. So, Shawn, the first thing we Korey and I talked about was you spoke, obviously, and you always talk about, obviously, the original OG, Nikolai Bernstein. So, you always talk about him. So, why in your mind is he the original, the OG, and why is he so important to you? And then you always talk about repetition without repetition. Just a recap, reminder, what does that exactly mean, repetition without repetition?
Yeah, and that's a great prompting question, or the great start, because, obviously the presentation and the content within it that I gave in Arizona is something that has been a really kind of my form of life, if you will, over the last number of years. The reason why I feel like I owe so much to him, and I want to, and not only I owe a debt of gratitude, but my players do as well, because his thoughts, his ideas, and many of the concepts that he kind of started and innovated, which have now been evolved considerably, obviously, since. But we're talking 50, 60, 70 years ago. If we look at any other discipline or domain in our understanding and thought processes and things of that nature, very few have had that type of lasting impact and influence. And even if you were to read the Coordination and Regulation of Movements, his book from 66 and 67, of course he died in 66, the book was published in 67. All of it within, if you really break it down and go through with a fine-tooth comb and uncover it and unlayer it, there's so much gold, there's so many nuggets that are still applicable, that we in this community of sport movement specialists, or our understanding of sport motor behavior, both in regards to motor control and motor learning, there's still so many unanswered questions, and many that he started to kind of guide and try to facilitate, try to channel our ideas towards. And that's why I really wanted to try to give ode to him, obviously, in my presentation, and why I talked about him as kind of that original gangster, because for me, if we all just kind of go back to some of the thoughts that were swirling around in his head and some of the things that he was investigating, not only in regards to some of the things that are more popularly known, if I can get my words out there, such as the mechanical degrees of freedom and sort of Bernstein's problem, of degrees of freedom. Even if we take that degrees of freedom problem and extend it to open sport movement chaos, that we see when we see chaos and how that problem and solution interact, many of the thoughts and ideas that are being kind of trickled and percolated by ecological dynamics, both ecological psychology on the one hand, many ideas from J.J. Gibson and many others who then have started to apply it more to sport, as well as some of the dynamical systems theory, and we take that and merge that. You see such a great reflection of it in many of Bernstein's writings. Again, coordination and regulation of movement from the 60s, but also dexterity and its development, which came later, which that first half of that book is so valuable. When we look at dexterity and the ability to find any solution or any respective movement solution to perfectly match the problems that our athletes face, when it's all is said and done, all three of us have had this conversation before, both on air, Michael, you and I as well, off air between the two of us and Korey and I for sure as well. That's what sport is about. Sport is nothing but a problem-solving activity, right? Where movements are used to produce the necessary solutions. And of course, Sif and Verkhoshansky told us that, but that all stemmed from Bernstein. And so for me, his whole idea of repetition without repetition, I think I mentioned this in my presentation. The very first time I read where he first mentioned repetition without repetition and how it should be every problem that an athlete faced had to not only, we're not finding a solution to that problem, that's going to be repeated in a rote type fashion. It's not perfected in that way. What we become is this organism that's connected to the environment. The problem exists in the environment. We as the organism exist within that environment problem interaction. And as the problem changes, so does our solution. And in this repetition without repetition type fashion, knowing that no two problems are ever the same, that means no two solutions will ever be identical and the same either. We have to understand what information within that problem and environment we must become attuned to. So what now is known in ecological dynamics as the affordances for action, which I mentioned in my presentation, I look at as kind of that lock and key interaction. But then from there, we have to have the practice means and methods that are setting that athlete up to that attunement to that information, but then the adaptation of the skill and I talk about this frequently, the 3 B's of the biodynamic structure of that human movement system, the behaviors, the brain, and the biomechanics, or some could look at it as being the sensory and perceptual side and the attunement there from a behavioral standpoint to the brain and the cognitive decision-making, and then finally the biomechanics and the action. So perception, intention, and action in this one cyclical type fashion, if we can practice in those ways rather than just a repeating of a means of a solution, I think we make our athletes not only more attuned, but also more adaptive. And to me, that's really what dexterity is about. Being able to find that solution to any problem under any context that our sport may give us. But in order to do that, as both of you gentlemen know, we have to expose the athlete to that representative type of environment as well. So I know I kind of said a mouthful there, but when you give me a chance to talk about the OG, I'm going to take that opportunity.
So what do you say, what do we think about when you have maybe a younger athlete or just, an inexperienced athlete and a common, drawback to this, putting athletes into this more of a chaotic or representative environment is, well, they don't exhibit maybe some what we could perceive as key biomechanical efficiency or movement skills to acquire them to go into this more chaotic or open environment. So what do you say something like that where, well, they need to work on the fundamentals or these technical or kinematic techniques before they go be exposed to an open environment? What do you say to that kind of coach? That, because I'm sure you hear that quite a bit, and I hear that quite a bit, is what do you say to that?
Yeah, and it doesn't just happen with the younger athletes, right? I see it in my population, and I know I kind of talk about this with both of you guys as well. First off, the thing that, through all motor behavior research and science at this point, people can't even agree yet holistically as to what optimal biomechanics is. We might have our certain technical models of movement, but even then, when we look at the most elite performers, there's a high amount of variability and deviation from that technical model in many cases. So if those who are performing at the highest levels of those respective movement tasks or skills don't exhibit our, maybe stick within this really small confine of what we commonly refer to as perfect technique or perfect biomechanics, I think it's really esoteric for us to expect that, any one of us can tell a kid that they have to stick within this repeatable, idealized motor pattern execution. And I think I kind of mentioned this in my presentation as well. When I first made the transition from a really an emphasis on physical preparatory means and methods and trying to increase upon general motor abilities or even specific motor abilities, physical characteristics for my players. When I started to gravitate towards a movement-centric approach, I too kind of adopted this technical model of any movement skill and the repeatability, the kind of perfect practice makes perfect type of idea. And then what I realized is, though they seem to get better in the practice domain and arena, it was never actually transferring to the game on Sunday. And all of a sudden, when the chaos got to be too large, or the pressure and anxiety and fatigue and things like that, or maybe certain environmental changes occurred, whether it's in surface or crowd or those types of things, what happened then is those perfect biomechanics that were showing themselves in my cute, sexy drills that I could put on YouTube or put on Twitter and social media wasn't showing themselves on an NFL Sunday. And the reality check for me was, that's where I need to get them better at. If I don't make them better there, I didn't really make them better. I might have made them better at practice tasks or tasks that they know how to perform in more of that rote repetition type of fashion. And so I'm not saying that we should throw all athletes to the wolves, but what I am saying is this, gentlemen, is that we should never study action separated from perception. And the perception and the action and the intention that lies in the middle, per my answer of the first question, is this constant cyclical relationship. It's constantly ongoing. But yet in this industry and in our profession, even myself formerly, we are so accustomed to wanting to study the biomechanics independently of the perception and intention. And then we have this sort of asymmetry that occurs with the organism, where we only study the organism and we study him or her in separation from the problem or the environment. And then we also take the biomechanics and we give the biomechanics too much, maybe credit or too much due, and too much of our attention and time. And instead, we forget about the perception and intention in the environment and the problem, which this is all this big, messy conglomeration, if you will, that's all stuck. And the human movement system must integrate a solution to that. And so for me, when people say, well, I need them to be able to repeat a certain biomechanics, I'm not saying you have to throw all of your old activities and drills away. You might just have to look for ways to adjust them, to make them more of a repetition without repetition type of fashion. So the behaviors in the brain, so the sensory and perceptual qualities, as well as the cognitive decision-making, can get linked back into your activities. And the action can get tied back into the perception, because we shouldn't study one without the other. J.J. Gibson told us that back with direct perception work back in, the ecological psychology side, way back in the late 70s. And obviously many have expanded upon it since. And I think that's really the key here. When we see actions that are emerging, we have to look and understand if the athlete behaved accordingly to the way that they will in the sport domain as well. So I know I took again, a kind of wordy answer there, but it's such a heavy topic for me. And it doesn't matter if it's an athlete, again, at a lower level of mastery or one that resides at a higher level of mastery. mastery to me exists in that connection at all three B levels. It's multidimensional, it's multi-level, it's intertwined and it's integrated, and we can never separate any one of those systems or the processes that occur at those subsystems of the human movement system, at least for me. And, I've been able to see the transition then for my athletes when I went from this perfect practice model to maybe changing my definition of what perfect practice really means to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think about sometimes, this might be a poor analogy, but if you just skip to the end of a book or a movie and you look at the ending, and that's what we sometimes do. We see a player make a move on a field, and we just look at that biomechanical structure. Well, same as going to the end of the movie, that won't make any sense without all the context leading up to that movement. What they perceive, what was the environment like. So it's the same thing, the book leads to the ending, or a movie leads to the last scene, just as everything that led up to that kinematic or motor response, how the athlete perceived it, when and where and why they perceived it, the environmental constraints, the task constraints, all lead into what they chose as their most appropriate at that time motor response. And like you said, when you take that out of context, you're missing the big, like you said, the big picture there. And so another concept you talked about was, I think we have this perception that reactive agility or open environments have to be really messy, or they have to be really dangerous, if you kind of would. But the reality is you can make a movement reactive or open, and it can still be very, very safe. And there's not much risk going on in terms of, it's not two guys always running at each other full speed, trying to juke each other. There are simpler ways and safe ways to make your environment more reactive and more, like you said, representative, that aren't excessively dangerous. And I think that's kind of a misconception that we get in our field, that reactive agility is dangerous. Well, the reality is you can make small tweaks and changes to maybe some of those closed drills, but make them, like you said, a little bit more open reactive that aren't excessively dangerous.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Oftentimes, because I'm always talking about messy problems, and kind of getting an athlete to facilitate their movement skills so they can test out their respective solutions accordingly. At whatever level of that human movement system, again, behaviors, brains, and biomechanics, you're going to probably hear me say that a lot. At whatever level that athlete is kind of becoming attuned to timing and in both space and time, their response and their solution. And I think that's the biggest thing, just giving them sort of sampling within that representative learning environment so that athlete can start to learn what to become attuned to. Oftentimes we see that small changes in the perception or intention lead to huge changes in the overall biodynamic structure of that movement solution. So if we just make them a little bit more comfortable with a little bit more discomfort in our drills, it doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't have to be super messy. And we just want to layer that messiness, layer that variability of that motor problem. So then we layer in variability and adaptability for the respective athlete and their movement responses.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Hey, can I ask one question, Michael?
Go in there, Korey. Yeah.
So can you maybe give some examples of how let's say you have an athlete comes in and they're just not ready for messiness. They're not ready for some chaos. They're just not, they need a little bit more of controlled environment or controlled activities before you throw in some pressure and whatnot. How do you progress them, especially early on, keeping in mind the fact that you're never taking out perception and action? You know, we're strength coaches, we get really, I think, uncomfortable with that because we don't always know where to start then because we love progressions. That's so ingrained in physical preparation. Oh, what's your progression for this? You got to start with the earliest progression and then the next one and then the next one and then the next one. But if we always have some kind of perception in there where you're making decisions, you're changing intention, where do you start and how do you sprinkle in and add more variability, more pressure? And what's kind of your process there, or what would something look like?
Yeah, and that's a fantastic question, Korey. First off, to kind of the start of your question or your point, when we often categorize or lump athletes into not being ready for the more uncontrollable environments, oftentimes it's that they haven't become or gotten the opportunities to kind of test out their movement solution or movement solving kind of process. And so that, of course, starts with the point that you made in your question there is we never separate the information to be perceived upon or to be changing our intention around, because once we separate that, almost anyone with enough repetitions can repeat the respective biomechanics. So I think that's first and foremost, that even if we see their biomechanics faltering, it might be a perception and intention issue or fault as much as it is a biomechanics fault in error. And that's a loose, sloppy way of looking at it. But just as we kind of talk about that concept, oftentimes they just haven't gotten the opportunity to become attuned to the information. So how would they ever become attuned to the information if we just separate them and have them repeat rote repetition? I think that's first and foremost point number one. Number two there, I agree with you. We need some level to start at. I'm not by any means, and sometimes I've been accused of this, of just throwing athletes to the wolves and into the fire, right? That if that's what we've interpreted as them needing greater, let's say, attunement, in those attunement and understanding of themselves to the problems, and within that chaotic, ever-changing environment of sport, then we should just throw them into sport, right? But we need progression, and we need that sampling, and we need small adjustments to the problem. And that's first and foremost my argument to saying we can't just let it happen by chance. If we know that there's problems occurring in their intrinsic dynamics or their human movement system and the solution they're coming up with to the respective problem within their sport, we have to kind of unlayer it, strip it back, and give them sampling. We have to simplify the activity to the degree needed, not to the smallest degree possible. And I think that kind of speaks to what your question is pertaining to. That means that, there is some more difficulty when we start to work with bigger groups, much like what you do, Korey, and this is something that we've talked about a lot, is just allowing the environment to behave according to the level of mastery and skill of the athlete. I understand that gets messier, but again, we have to, and an N equals 1, individual by individual basis. That's why it's really nonlinear. This isn't a linear pedagogy here. This is a nonlinear one. Everybody reacts in different ways at different time scales to the same problem. And I know I made or quoted Bernstein in the presentation where he says no phenomenon can be understood without carefully considering how it emerged. And so that there's kind of twofold there is what is the experiences of the respective athlete? So that gives us some idea in inkling in regards to where we might be able to start in that progression. And I hate to call it a progression, but I know what you're saying there. It's that starting point. And then from there, as long as we're not separating the information from the movement or the action, I think that's first and foremost. We just got to simplify the task enough so we can reform how that movement skill will emerge later on. So we got to give that athlete new experiences, new exposures, new understanding, and we have to give them opportunities to test solutions to the respective problems that they're going to find in their sport. And I think that for me is so key, because everybody's going to solve problems differently. And as they do that, we start to see how unique their individual responses are. And that's not only what will happen, but it's what should happen. We're looking for movement authenticity, and we're looking for movement problem or motor problem fit between the solution and the organism and that problem. And so to me, that place to start, Korey, is really the place where it's controllable enough. The problem isn't watered down to the point where the information is eliminated, but we just start to layer in more variability within that problem. And it could be something as simple as a simple, cat and mouse activity that I've seen both of you guys do and we're just changing starting positions, or we're changing opponent position. Michael, I know you threw out a video not that long ago with something similar to that. And Korey, I know you've done the same, and we change angles, and we change spacing, and we change speeds, and we change opponents, and all of a sudden, even if it's a really simple activity, the individual athlete in their human movement system gets a chance to adjust. And because they get a chance to attune themselves to the information in the changing problem, that's where that adjustment and adaptability kind of flows from. And it's not overly messy then when you look at it in that regard. It's just not as cute and neat and nice and sexy and sweet as when, you know, we're typically used to letting athletes run through in this kind of assembly line, rote repetition type fashion, where they just know where they're going to cut and they know how far they're going to go, and they can almost pre-plan their steps and their responses. That's the part that's messy about it. But the great thing about that, gentlemen, as you both know, is that's the part that's the missing link. That's the conduit between us as physical preparatory specialists, if we want to look at ourselves in that way, or as strength and conditioning professionals in group, and what's happening out in the sport.
So is it enough then to, you know, you hear a lot about, okay, you're going to go from changing, maybe they're going off of a visual stimulus or an auditory stimulus or different colored cones, or like you mentioned, even changing start positions or positions of the cones. Is that enough, or do we?
I think it's a start. It's a start. The one thing that, you know, when we talk about that information, the information, when I say information, for all those listeners out there, I know you guys understand what I'm talking about here, but this information is really our understanding about the nuances of the problem, right? The information that exists between task and organism and environment. And in the middle there lies the information about that problem. We have to be really careful, if we're not going to eliminate the information, that we also don't impoverish the information too much. There might be times that we can test it and tease the movement solution based on changing the problem, such as using fit lights or different colored cones, or, you know, just changing some of those small nuances of the problem. But we have to ensure that the problem itself acts, feels, looks, behaves what it's going to in sport, as well, at least to as much degree as we possibly can. Again, we can test it and tease it, because there we start to see the robustness, the resiliency of that movement solution and that individual movement system within that context, you know, like how they can come up with that respective solution. So oftentimes people see me utilizing some of those things and they're like, wait a minute, I thought you said no cones, or don't have this person look for a cone, because they're not going to look for a cone out on the field. But there's certain times that I might test the movement solution a little bit by just changing the problem ever so slightly. So I think we can't, when you say, is that enough? I don't believe it's enough, but it can be a starting point, or it can be like a signpost. Like, how can, when we change the context slightly, does the individual in their human movement system come up with a similar solution, or does the whole thing fall apart? You know, does it all kind of unravel? Because we've all seen that. When an individual kind of gets really comfortable in a certain drill, that's why I hesitate, as you guys both know, to call things drills. They're just activities of exposure and experience. We're trying to shape experiences. We're trying to shape exposure through. So from that and flowing from that emerges this ability of adaptability.
Yeah, I love the quote you had in your presentation. Drills don't always transfer, but skills do. So like you said, the goal of, you know, these drills, if you would, is to improve skills that will transfer. So you're trying to work on and expose or give them experience to developing these different nuances of these skills, because that's what will eventually transfer to the sport, not, you know, these rote repetition drills.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that for me, Michael, probably where you're kind of going with this too, is that was such a key question for me when I really started to ask myself the hard questions, look myself in the mirror, when I was taking already a really, when you and I first got introduced to each other, in fact, you know, and it was maybe a more perfect practice or more repeatable and idealized motor pattern that I was after for each one of my players. And I started to look at my game's best, the National Football League's best, and I started to see, okay, you got guys like Barry Sanders and Jerry Rice and Deion Sanders and all these types of guys, right? The list goes on and on, the Lawrence Taylors, the Ray Lewises, fill in the blank, right? And I started to see a lot of variation or maybe deviation. When I say that, I'm also not saying that, they're violating certain biomechanical truths. That's the other thing. We don't just allow any movement signature to emerge. We still want to shape it and channel it. But on that same token, we got to allow for a certain amount of variability bandwidth, if you will, in that individual solution, because we got to find their authenticity within their movement signature in the formation and coordination and control and organization of that movement solution. So I don't even know how I got on that tangent, but I wanted to throw that in there.
Well, it's a good thing to mention, Shawn, because I think that's where people, well, if you're saying if the right movement is whatever fits the lock, so if you think of the solution as the key, and if they solve the solution, they were able to unlock it, how can you say if anything is good or bad, and how do we as professionals coach that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Maybe the greatest question that keeps me up at night and keeps me losing my hair each day. Because that key and lock situation, Korey, which you kind of just pointed to, is such a fascinating one, because you could put all three of us under a similar behaving problem and circumstance, right? And we're all going to come up with different solutions because we've all interpreted the problem differently based on our past exposures, based on how we know to fixate our perceptual attention, and maybe what decisions we can make based on our own affordances for action and our own action capabilities. And then from there, the biomechanical action is going to emerge differently. And I think that's the key issue there. Sometimes we have to put ourselves out there on a limb, and that's what I started doing with myself right from the start, which is what I was talking about just, right prior to this with that whole drills versus skills thing. When I didn't see the drills, what movement patterns, let's just call them the movement solution within that drill,
right?
When it wasn't showing itself in similar ways out on the field, so it wasn't representative of, if we want to look at it in that way, it made me start taking this good, cold, hard look, and I started realizing, like, wait a minute, did these guys that display this really effective and efficient and proficient movement problem solving, did they use these drills to attain that movement signature? And oftentimes, Barry Sanders became Barry Sanders because the problem was really chaotic and he had to find a freaking way, and even when you hear him talk in interviews from back in the day, he talks about, I only had one intention, and it was to make people miss, for example. I mean, I think that becomes really telling. I'm not saying that there's certain things that we shouldn't do on repeat, maybe such as Jerry Rice, going out and running routes or so, something like that. But all he was doing was giving himself exposure in those ways, and I'm not talking about like the hill running and things like that. I'm talking about the actual mastery within his craft. And I think what we find from those individuals is oftentimes those drills that we're utilizing are like the end result thing. It's like the thing that Michael was talking about with getting to the end of the book. With the contents in between didn't say that that person utilized those activities. We just happen to see this biomechanical model emerge, and we grasp onto a drill to make that biomechanical model emerge without realizing that it was a solution to a respective problem and what that individual is interpreting at that moment. So when I talk about what will kind of flow from that problem solution interaction and how we deem it to be optimal, or, just because something is organized and the problem was solved, it's way it was solved at that moment. That can change across the time scale. It could change the very next time that they were faced with a similar behaving problem if they perceive it differently. And, you guys have both heard me say that oftentimes in our professions, across our professions, we try to make sport movement way too simplistic. And that's just not respecting the complexity of the human movement system. There's a reason why we haven't been able to figure out that, how to make a robot. A robot can beat the top chess masters the world has ever seen, but a robot can't walk in an environment that requires it to be dexterous and adaptable. So to try and act as though we can be gatekeepers to what's optimal versus what's suboptimal for movement, I think we're not at that point yet. And we can only kind of put ourselves out on a limb to a certain degree and try to understand, maybe by pushing or channeling and constraining, if we want to use that word, which I think is a great one, because obviously, as I know you guys both do, as well as you know I do, we're just trying to manipulate constraints to see how that individual will try to organize their movement solution different under those ever-changing dynamics of the problem too. We got to respect the problem. And that's the whole thing for me, you know? And once we do that, we can put ourselves out there on a limb. You guys see me try to do it all the time. Like, well, if I would have, been working with this athlete, here's, A, B, and C of what I've suggested or would suggest he or she do under a similar behaving problem off of that, which what I know. I'm not acting as though, that's going to be more optimal. I'm just trying to think of, maybe different things that they can do to open up their movement toolbox a little bit and maybe increase their adaptability, increase their dexterity, increase the diversity of their movement toolbox. And really that's what it's all about. We talk about mastery. Mastery to me is not mastering, a few motor patterns, because, unless we're in a really closed pre-planned sport, and even at that, variability is kind of the signpost of a really healthy human movement system as well.
Right.
Someone who can't be variable isn't going to be successful for long.
So maybe would you suggest for people trying to, plan sessions, would you maybe, because we like to think of things as, oh, I'm going to try to improve the 10 or the 40 or their pro agility. What do I need to do to accomplish that? And that sometimes drives sessions, right? Or what you do in a session. And would you maybe start with like, okay, here's my sport. What situations do these players find themselves in? And how can I present those within our training? And then work backwards from there to construct activities versus.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to think about it as well. Obviously, that requires us to really strip a lot of things back, right? I mean, we all talked about this. I know that, for those listeners out there, I think we had, Korey and Michael and myself, as well as a few others when we were in Arizona, had about a 4.5 or 5 hour conversation at my hotel, kind of really everything kind of goes back to this, right? Mm-hmm. Our analysis of the problems that exist within the sport. I think we've gotten so good at really cute and neat biomechanical analysis, but we forgot about the analysis of the problem and the solution connection. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes we think that that's what the sport coach's job is, but as you guys both know, I've had many position coaches, even at the National Football League level, come and watch what I do, and they're like, I'm not doing any of this. Where are you getting this from? But all we're doing is really making the problem behave a lot like what the sport does. And we're sampling from a representative task type fashion. We're sampling it in those ways. But in order for me to do that, gentlemen, just as you guys both know, as well as the listeners out there, I got to understand the problems that exist within the sport really, really well.
Yeah.
Because if I don't give them the same look and feel and kind of problem behavior, we're sure not going to have the solution behavior and emergence either. And I think that's really what it comes down to. So when you talk about kind of that reverse engineering type of way, Korey, I think that's really what it comes down to. I believe, and I think I mentioned this at least in our meeting, a few weeks ago in Arizona, I believe we all have to sit down and watch more movement. We have to discuss what we believe is happening there. Again, not only biomechanically, but at a multi-level, multi-dimension of that solution and problem connection. We can't continue to place this really asymmetrical approach on the biomechanics or an asymmetrical approach on just the organism. We have to look at the whole. We have to look at the systems that are at play here. And that's the whole thing, whether it's the systems within that individual and how they're responding, but also the bigger system that individual athlete exists within. And then when we start to open it up, and I know I made it really messy a couple of weeks ago when I said, one of the things I've really been looking at is kind of this whole idea of shared affordances, when it's you and a teammate and you and a teammate versus another 1 or 2 or 3 opponents, maybe up to 11, right? That idea, again, goes back to that whole idea. We're trying to simplify sport movement too much. We want to simplify it enough, but not so much that we make it something that doesn't resemble sport movement. And that's what I see too many people doing.
Yeah, I feel like I've gotten caught in that trap too. And let's just kind of stick with football because, this summer, it's getting later in the summer, and I kind of start thinking about this, representative practice design. And I think, crap, we've only been doing one-on-one this whole time.
Yeah.
Which is what I think so many prep coaches do. It's always one-on-one tag or whatever when we get to these more open drills. And so I started to think to myself, I got to start adding in other people. I have to create more variables for the offensive or defensive player to worry about, which is what they have to do on the field, right? But that just opens up a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, it really does, and I know that I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago as well. It's all about layering then. It kind of goes back to your other question and your other point before. If we start to talk about that progression, and we can know and understand and respect that it's going to be a really nonlinear process, not only for each individual athlete, but through whatever movement skill we're trying to get them to acquire. And I use that word acquire really loosely there because I don't believe we're, again, acquiring anything per se. We're either becoming attuned and adaptive or we're not, and or more attuned and more adaptive or we're not. And I think that's the whole thing. We have to look to layer it as much as we possibly can in the context of the athletes that we're working with and the problems that we believe and understand that they're going to face in their representative task. And it's not like, gentlemen, it's not like these thoughts and ideas are overly new per se. Egon Brunswick was talking about this back in 56 or 58 or something ridiculous like that. And of course, Bernstein in the 50s and 60s was talking about variability and repetition without repetition and many others since then. But we're late to adopt it, because we want to be able to control for so many factors. And it goes back to that, what you were talking about earlier, Korey, we want our progressions.
Yep.
Sometimes it's just open to the creativity of the coach or instructor. And if we can just look to be more facilitative roles rather than coaching roles, that's the hat that you got to turn around right away. And Korey, I know you and I kind of talked about this when you first started incorporating these activities as well. Korey, you got to stop coaching and you got to just start looking to facilitate. And if you facilitate in the wrong direction, just bring them on back and kind of go down a different direction, and sometimes it will require us as sort of the sport movement specialist to not know exactly what's going to occur either. And that's a hard reality check for some, of course, especially if you're working with a multi-million-dollar athlete or even if you're working with a highly sensitive, lower-level athlete.
Right.
And I think something that, talking about this is that also have to, appreciate that we're going against that our athletes are going against other human beings who are also at the very moment, they are also altering and changing their movement solution based on what they see your athlete doing. They're not robots. And so that's something that's, I think about baseball. If I was playing D-back in football and a receiver beat me in a route, for the next 60 minutes, that route's in my mind, that I'm not going to make sure that move that he did, whatever his movement solution will not beat me again. So you have to rewind back and have maybe some empathy, or you have to put yourself in the opponent's shoes sometimes. I always tell my athletes, put yourself in the opponent's shoes. What have you used previously that's been successful? Because guess what? That's not going to work again. So with Everson, you talk about your DN, he may do a move, get a sack. Guess what? That old lineman will say, I'm not going to get beat by that move again. How can you counter that? How can you be more adaptive in your movements to have a move off of that, whatever it may be? One thing that we got to make sure athletes understand is that we're not going against robots. The opponent is also, at the very moment that we're changing and we're thinking about new things and movement solutions, they're doing the same thing. And so it's like a cat and mouse game. Watch. That's what I love about baseball is every at bat, what's the next pitch going to be? It's the cat and mouse between the hitter and the pitcher. Same with movement in basketball, football, rugby, soccer, etc. What was used in the first play, second play of the game, that's going to dictate some of the movement solutions or adaptability later on in the game as well, which is a hard concept, I think, for coaches to conceptualize.
Yeah, because you get that to emerge right on the fly, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's explicit and we're discussing it explicitly, or whether it becomes very implicitly driven and it's more subconscious and where it's being held and how it's being held. I think the thing that you naturally get there when you pit two athletes against one another, or then multiple athletes against one another, where maybe you have a different opponent that you're facing each and every time that you're coming out with it. It forces you to dig into the toolbox and find an adaptive solution. And you talked about Everson in there. It's one thing that he and I have discussed a lot of. Many times, even if his movement was, let's call it quote unquote correct, in that it solved the problem. Maybe he sacked the quarterback or whatever it might be. Knowing that that individual, like you said, Michael, isn't going to give up that sack again, maybe in that same way. But how do we build or layer our movement strategies and solutions off of that? How do we become more adaptable, knowing that that individual gets paid to do what they do as well, and they're likely going to adapt? And I think that's one of the cool things about, you talk about that pitcher-hitter combination. I think we see that, kind of on display for everyone. But we see it a lot, really, in that whole Everson or any defensive end against an offensive tackle who they might be facing 50, 55, 60 times in that respective game. And, you, as the defensive end, you beat that guy twice, and you put yourself in the running for Defensive Player of the Year. You beat that player twice every week, whoever that respective player is, and you definitely did. You just had the most record-breaking season of the entire NFL.
Right.
So I think the context there is such a unique one, because we see this constant interplay then between problem and solution. And it goes back to what both of you guys just said, in the last 3 to 5 minutes here, is both individuals are constantly adapting and we're constantly evolving. And because of that adaptation and because of that evolution, we're getting new emergent movement behaviors to emerge as well. Like that behavior from me. If you and I are interacting with one another and you're the problem and I'm the solution, you're behaving differently, so will I. Right. As long as, we're staying adaptable and deliberate and focused and intentional. And something that you said in there, Michael, is so key. Because if we're going to have this dialogue then, too often in dynamical systems theory or constraints-led approach or ecological psychology or ecological dynamics, and I put all of those lumped into one, kind of did that long run-on redundant sentence, because oftentimes, people will point to any one of those and say, it's not cognitive enough. We're not explicit enough. We're not directing the intention enough. But if all we do is set up our activities to where it can facilitate a change in movement solution, and make it adaptable. Number 2, or B, whichever one I said first there, is the other side of it is we can ask them discovery type of questions. That's one thing that I try to do. It becomes a very cognitively driven movement solution then as well, because once that athlete just starts thinking about that, if I ask, what did you feel there? Or what do you feel would have worked better there? That becomes cognitive. Even though I'm not explicitly telling Everson, I want you to do this next time when that shows up. If all I do is facilitate his mindset to grasp itself around what just happened and what could potentially happen from here on out, I think we kind of put that connection back into their wheelhouse. We give them permission to be in control and have ownership. And isn't that really what we're all after anyway? Right. I'm not out there explicitly telling Everson, I want you to do A, B, and C next time, but I'm asking him leading questions. And I'll tell you what, you guys know it as well as I do, at least I think you do based on the conversations we've talked about prior to this point, is it takes more skill as a movement coach or as a physical preparation coach to do that than to know exactly how that guy's supposed to perform. I mean, there I'm just offering educated guesses and suggestions anyway. So by asking him prompting questions, or any of my athletes prompting questions, to get them to consciously think enough about it, but not constrain their movement solution, not constrain their action to the point where it can't emerge the way that it needs to later on, I think is so vital. And it's such a hard to develop skill unless you're just doing it in a really deliberate fashion each and every day as the coach or practitioner.
Well, that might be more important to transfer of training than any drill that we set up. Like if we're letting the athlete become better problem solver because they have to learn about themselves more and not just like rely on coaches telling them what to do.
Yeah.
Like, boom. I mean, if we're seeking transfer of training, there you go. You now have allowed them to be more adaptable in the field so they can handle more of situations. So I think that's a huge.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I think you're definitely onto something there. You know, I always talk about, and you guys have heard me talk about this as well. I talk frequently about trying to hand over the keys to the car.
Right.
And early in my career, I wanted to tell them exactly how they should behave. And I did it through constant instruction and constant feedback. And if they didn't do it right that time, I just felt like they needed more reps in order to get it right, in order to understand what they needed to do. But even my most masterful of athletes then weren't behaving that way out on the field on Sunday. And I realized maybe I just wasn't setting up the situation to help facilitate their movement skill in that way when we were trying to form it. You know, like I said, no phenomenon can be understood without carefully understanding how it emerged. And if we think about how it emerged and it was a really explicitly, consciously driven direction from me as the coach, I'm doing them a disservice. I'm not facilitating or giving the keys to the car at all. I'm not allowing them to drive the car and allowing them to be authentic and creative and to have full control. And then if an error occurs, then they come back and be like, Shawn, I thought you said that was supposed to work.
Right.
You know, and I'm like, no, this is a partnership now. You know, like when it becomes a partnership where you're offering suggestions or promptings or you're trying to facilitate, they are more in control than you are. And like you said, Korey, I think that's the ultimate level of that next step in movement skill, right? If they can't be skillful by themselves as an independent mover and understand themselves in time and space and the problems that they might face, it's highly unlikely when chaos and pressure and fatigue and anxiety and all those things kind of enter the mix. It's really, how can we expect that to emerge there if we never got them a chance to test those things out?
Yeah, and that maybe even gets into the importance of making mistakes in training too.
Yeah.
Which we talked about. If you made the kind of analogy of how'd you learn how to ride a bike? You know, you had to make mistakes. So I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Michael.
No, I mean, like you said, I think coaches are afraid to have, like we've said, practice, training be messy, or athletes make mistakes because we think then that will lead to them making mistakes in the game or something like that. And oftentimes, maybe for, Korey and I working with college teams, for us, sometimes the most stressful environment is when the head coach is out there watching and there's guys making mistakes, or you have maybe what they perceive as their best player getting beat by a lower level player, or a head sport coach. They're probably big pressure is having the AD or boosters come watch a practice. And practices like guys are dropping past, or not necessarily that's the right thing, but practice doesn't look clean.
Right.
But the problem is, like you said, Korey, if you never fell off a bike, then you never learn how to make the adjustments to control your body to stay on the bike. If you never make any mistakes, then you never learn how to do something correctly. So that's a very valuable tool. But I think we're all afraid of making mistakes because we perceive mistakes as negatives rather than seeing the positive aspects of mistake making.
Yeah, I think we have to start craving mistakes again and understanding and packaging them accordingly. If we look at the distinction between motor performance and motor learning first and foremost, there's certain times of the year, don't get me wrong, like where I want my guys, if it's a Friday and they play on Sunday, I probably want them performing really crisp and really cleanly on that Friday, so they can get their confidence up and their psychological characteristics kind of flow from that, right? But if we're in the middle of the summer and they don't have to perform on a football field in front of 70,000 people again for months, I better work on the things and help them, put them in a learning stage where they move into that learning zone where it's just outside of their reach and they're trying to test theories, if you will, or they're trying to test their strategies for that solution. And I think that's really what it comes down to there, Michael, is we have to understand where we are. Are we after motor performance or are we after motor learning? And for most of us, at least those in charge of strength and conditioning, probably at most times of the year should be after motor learning. You know, in our weight room settings and things like that, of course, we might be able to chase performance, but in our movement sessions, if we want them to become more skillful, if we want them to become more adaptive, if we want them to become more dexterous and have more virtuosity where they have more tools in the toolbox, we got to let them test it out. Otherwise, they've not fallen off the bike. You know, like the age-old cliche, a skillful driver was never created on straight roads, or without any other drivers on the road or without any change in conditions. It's the equivalent. It's the same thing with the bike. I wouldn't ride with someone who, in a car who only learned to drive in a parking lot with some cones stuck on the lot. If they're like, hey, get in the car, look how fast I can go through this parking lot and around these cones. Be like, great, what happens when some more cars enter the mix and it starts snowing because it's flipping Minnesota? It's like, what happens then? And we're not teaching our athletes how to drive their car on those roads. And then all of a sudden Sunday comes around or Friday night or wherever your athletes play, and then we expect them to be able to behave when there's other cars and weather conditions? I think not.
Yeah, I mean, two thoughts come to mind. I coached college football for a year, and I used to run the defensive scout team. And on Thursdays, early in the season, I, run the scout team, and I got to, basically apply the other team's defense to our offense. And so on Thursday, I was bringing, a little bit of an exotic blitz. And, after practice, the O-line coach came and, bitched at me. He's like, what the hell are you doing bringing these blitzes on Thursday for? I'm like, well, they do it. I have film to show you that they do it. And he's like, Thursday, we want to be clean and crisp. Kind of like you talked about, performance. On Thursday was a day for performance and confidence. He's like, I don't bring those stuff, but do it Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We want to win. Not the scout team, so for performance factors and for, confidence factors, so that what you said there brought me back to that day, and it made a ton of sense to me. The second part, I think the same thing you see with hamstring injuries and now ACLs is, people say, well, a lot of soccer teams and football teams are pulling hamstrings because athletes are never getting exposure to, top end sprinting speed. I think you could probably make a little bit of an argument. Obviously, it's multifactorial. Many things go into it, but maybe some things with soft tissue or non-contact injuries are occurring because for 6-7 months of the year, athletes aren't getting exposed to any kind of representative or open environments. It's all closed skill. Like you said, you drive in a parking lot on cones. What the hell do you think is going to happen when you get on a high-speed highway? Same thing during the week or during training. You're doing rote 5-10-5 drills. What do you think is going to happen when you get into the game? Nothing good is going to happen.
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there. In fact, I mentioned this, 4 or 5 years ago when this sort of non-contact injury epidemic started occurring, or really the beginning of it was. So this would have been, I think 13 or 14, a few years removed from the new collective bargaining agreement in the NFL, which limited exposure to the strength and conditioning staffs. But it also limited exposure to the football staff as well. And so, too often in physical preparation, we say, well, they don't get enough time with us, so we don't get enough time to develop strength qualities or characteristics. But what do we know about change of direction versus agility in research? What we find is that the change of direction mechanics that someone exhibits when it's a change of direction task versus when it's pre-planned over here, versus when it becomes unpre-planned and it's chaotic and it's more open, then the biomechanics change considerably.
Right.
If biomechanics change considerably, all of a sudden that efficiency and effectiveness of whatever movement patterns emerge has decreased as well. And I think people are forgetting about that portion, because it's kind of the elephant in the room, because no one already wants to tackle this whole thing of trying to make more skillful movers in a messy way. But I think there's something to that, Michael, that you mentioned, because again, this is something that I talked about years ago, and everyone just, disregarded it and said, well, no, they just need to do more hamstring activity. Maybe it's a focus of our training means and our methods in the physical preparatory means that we're utilizing. And I don't think it's as much of that. I think it's what's happening in the actual behavioral dynamics that emerge when we put that individual in the problem, and how limited exposure they have throughout the rest of the course of the year in comparison to it. And then people will also say, to kind of piggyback on that, and this will just be an extra little tidbit, people will say, well, the later it goes in the season, typically we have a lot more of those injuries as well. And at that, it becomes a very multifactorial type of thing, number one. But number two, look at what happens to NFL practices as the season goes on. Shoot, it's not the same type of problem anymore on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, or whichever days that respective team is practicing. The problems don't behave the same way as it does on a field on Sunday. And they're getting that exposure when it's a chaos of the biggest degree. It's the highest degree possible. It's that busy freeway under the crazy weather changes, and that's the only exposure they're getting. So all they're doing, as you guys both know, is compensating. And sometimes, as I've always said, the NFL has the world's best compensators. They're going to compensate positively at certain times. There's going to also be times that they also compensate negatively, and it becomes really dysfunctional. And then we see some of those injuries occurring, those non-contact injuries, ACLs, MCLs, patellas, high ankle sprains, Achilles, so on and so forth. Hamstrings, which you obviously mentioned in your question, Michael. So whether it's soft tissue or whether it's connective tissue, I think it can be traced down to the behavioral dynamics and how comfortable that individual is within it.
So one thing you've pushed for, Shawn, and I think let's fingers crossed the next 10 years, every NFL team has a movement specialist or movement coach. So some of those things you talked about later in the year, whether practices, like you said, they're not the same as they were earlier. They're not as, close to Sunday in terms of speed, representative as you'd like. As a movement specialist or coach, what are some things that you'd be doing or trying to push to implement, say right now, it's week 8 in the NFL, week 9 in the NFL. What are some things that you'd be pushing now from here to the end to ensure some of those late season, whether it be injuries or decline in performance, don't occur? What are some things that you'd be pushing right now to the position coaches, the head coach, the strength staff, athletic staff, etc.?
Yeah, great question. Wonderful question, because I think that's where the true worth of, say, a movement skill acquisition coach on every respective team would really start to show and shine. For me, Michael, and those of you out here who've heard me talk about this in the past, it kind of all starts back at whatever that movement skill acquisition was really beginning. And, it's kind of this way of the constant layering that we talked about, to the point where right now we're actually still ramping up in some of those key performance indicators of that respective movement solution, as well as in the movement problem. I've often talked about, if you just take the individual position drills that last for 10 or 15 minutes every single day of an NFL practice, and you make adjustments to those practice drills and turn them into learning activities that involve all 3 B's of the human movement system. You involve perception of a constantly changing problem. You involve intention and cognitive decision making, a decision to be made within the respective problem that looks, feels, and acts like what happens on Sunday. And then you get that biomechanics more controlled and adjustable, adaptable to that problem. It becomes this evolution where they're actually becoming more masterful and more skillful as the season goes on. And people will say, well, that can't possibly happen because guys are getting more beat up, they're getting more fatigued. We're having maybe the emergence of certain compensations and such like that. But what we're doing is we're giving them ownership under those respective compensations. I've seen it over the last 10 years with my players, specifically the last 5, since I've made this transition to more representative tasks. I mean, I don't know if anyone's watching, but what you see, like with a guy like Everson, who you brought up as an example, but those players are becoming more adaptable. They're getting more tools in the toolbox. They're getting more adaptability of that respective tool to match the problems that they're facing each and every week. So the skill is actually increasing, even if it's, again, in this nonlinear type of fashion. I keep doing that little snake thing going up the screen. I understand that, but that's the way it's going. You know, there will be certain times where the movement on that day has maybe not found itself, not stabilized yet, so it's not actualizing. But we got to keep pushing it and prompting it and attempting to facilitate it. But what happens in most drills across the National Football League right now, and when I'm talking drills, ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking the things that are being done for 10 to 15 minutes with the position coaches. They're doing the same damn thing every freaking day. And it's the same stimulus. It's the same solution. And that individual isn't actually getting better in most cases. They're actually just staying the same because the problem isn't changing. So if we just make small tweaks and adjustments to the actual problems that the individual's facing more frequently, I think what you're going to see, Michael, at this time of the season, you know, when going from week 7 to week 8, and then obviously, you know, Everson and I have this quote where we say, come see us in week 16, because we're not doing it for right now. I'm not doing it for him to perform the best against the Cleveland Browns on Sunday in London. I'm doing it so in week 16, he's got it, given himself a chance to be the best version of himself, that his movement skill has evolved, and it has become at a point where, you know, he always jokes, and it was just on the, you know, it was just on a jersey he gave me from the Pro Bowl last year, which says, you know, the highest technique is to have no technique. It's a movement that's constantly evolving. It's a movement that's responsive to what the problem gives us. So I don't know if I answered your question there or not, or if it just created more questions.
No, absolutely. That's a pet peeve of mine too. Like you said, the individual period in football during the season is the most wasted time during practice. I mean, it's like fall camp, you'll work on different skills, and then they just, during the season, it's like, let's just waste 10 minutes and do the same crap every single day because that's what we do. But let's take a scenario here. So let's say running backs, okay? So running backs are notorious. They get the big blue bags out. They do a high knee, shuffle over it, and then run through the dummy arms with the ball in their hand, right? That's indie basically the whole year. What are some examples of ways that you would, you know, improve that indie? So they're not just going in and out of bags, running through a coach trying to hit the ball. What are some ways to make that a better indie?
Yeah, and you kind of faded out there a few times for whatever reason in that question, but I got kind of the gist of it there. The biggest thing for me, if we look at the application of a repetition without repetition type of scheme, again, I've often stated to position coaches that you don't have to completely abandon any and everything that you're married to prior to this point. I just suggest that you try to make a more functional relationship between the individual and the environment and allow them to become attuned and more sensitive to the relevant perceptual variables. So every single day, what I would do is just add a simple stimuli, add a decision to be made, add information that needs to be taken in. So maybe you're still utilizing those same activities because you really believe in sort of those KPIs at that respective position, the key performance indicators of that respective position. But if you just add a few variables to be perceived on any given day and you just change it, whether it's rep to rep on that respective day or from today to tomorrow, it doesn't behave exactly the same way. It's a small adjustment to the problem. It adds a little bit of messiness, but I can promise you it adds a ton of adaptability and a ton of adjustment for the calibration of those actions to that respective problem. And so I don't know if you already answered that in your question and that's where you faded out, but to me, that's the way to make it that much more applicable and that much more transferable because we're constantly evolving and becoming more attuned. And again, I know I've kind of worn out the word adaptability, but guys, that's really what it's about. If I can make my athletes more adaptable, independent of Shawn dictating what that individual does, I believe it's a success for me as a movement skill acquisition coach.
Beautiful. Korey, anything?
How long we got here?
I got about 10 minutes left.
Okay. I think we better end it there.
You sure?
Yep. I get because I would love to talk maybe more sometime because I feel like you're talking more about attunement and adaptability. And those are really interesting to me, but I'm not sure we got 10 minutes for it. So.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely go on to it. Other thing I want, Shawn, I remember you mentioned here back in Arizona was, right now it seems that vision and visual is getting a lot of love in terms of, obviously it's in a very important way that our brain perceives information, but it's not the only way. But it seems to be now that we're all crazy on eyes and we're doing these, synaptic, eye drills and vision type training. But like you touched upon in Arizona, it's not the only sense that our body uses to adapt our movement to. So if you could just briefly how, what are some other ways that our body's sensing movement or sensing the environment? And, obviously eyes are important, but what are some other things that are just as important or equally, we shouldn't forget about?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, Michael, and one that I'm highly passionate about too, because if we really talk about becoming attuned to the problem and the ever-changing problem, we cannot forget about the other subsystems of the sensory information that's going to come in. I often talk about this kind of redundant sensory data that we're all exposed to. If we're all in the same problem, we're all exposed to potentially the same sensory data. The only difference between the expert mover and the less expert mover or the less masterful mover is that individual who resides at a lower level of mastery, they are usually going to only gravitate towards the dominant sensory data that's coming in. Typically, that's the vision, of course, because the vision is our most powerful sensory system, right? It's the one that's most abundant. But there's also an abundance of a lot of other sensory data that's coming in, whether it's through our hearing and the things that we're hearing and how we're hearing and interpreting the problem, our haptic or our touch, so what we're touching in the environment, whether it's at the ground or at our hand, depending on what sport task we're performing. Our kinesthetic sense and our awareness that exists from a proprioceptive standpoint is going to tell us a lot of information. So all of these things, what we find, and Keith Davids and Eduardo Ruggiero have done a great amount of research on this, what they find in expert movers is that individuals who reside at this high level of mastery involve the more sensory systems or more sensory data and use that to come up with the right solution. So if we're really talking about this information kind of guiding and facilitating and dictating to a certain degree what potential opportunities for action that we have that we must adapt to, we want the most specifying of information, right? So there's some research that's fascinating out there in regards to that, again, Davids and others have done in both cricket as well as rugby, as well as some in ice climbing. And you start to see some of this stuff kind of unfold, and you see that lower level performer becomes really attuned to the most clear specifying information. Again, that's through the vision most often. But in order to come up with the most optimal solution that's going to be timed appropriately and affords the most amount of opportunities for action, we got to take it in from everywhere. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll impoverish, and this will be a big thought or idea, I'll sometimes impoverish the vision. And what I mean by that is, I might occlude something. And I know that Dr. Peter Faddy talked about this at the Skill Acquisition Conference in visual occlusion, baseball, hitting and pitch recognition and the decision making that goes along with that. Mm-hmm. You occlude, so you start to become attuned to the most specifying information. You then have to become more attuned to the other sensory data that's coming in too, your haptic and your touch and your proprioceptive sense. And before long, and now this is really a big can of worms, obviously, that gets opened up here, and we start to unlayer this with any respective movement problem. But what we find then is that the behaviors or the athlete's sensory and perceptual skill becomes so vital to what solutions they could possibly attach their decisions to. And, so for me, vision is important. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Things like the quiet eye and knowing when to look, where to look, and maybe how long to look are important. But knowing what it means to your movement and how it connects to the other aspects of sensory data that might be coming in, the position that you're in and the data that you have intrinsically from that, your kinesthetic sense and awareness, more things that we can do to direct our attention to that, we might find a lot of gold there. So, I often ask my players, what were you feeling at this respective moment? We might watch a video or something like that of an athlete solve a problem. And I may say, what were you feeling at this moment? And they may try to tell me what they were seeing. And that's cool. I want to know what they're seeing because that's important information, right? And Michael, you and I had this conversation in a couple of cases back in Arizona as well. But some of that of what was important to me is, what were they really feeling? Like internally, were they feeling or aware of anything? And if I can make them just a tad more aware, not overly consciously driven to the point where, again, constrains their action, but just aware enough so they understand some of those more opportunities for action, maybe their degrees of freedom. Again, we talk about degrees of freedom, and this is a whole nother topic that we could talk about for probably another hour. But the degrees of freedom, to me, isn't just mechanical. All props to my man, the OG again, when he only talked about mechanical degrees of freedom. But if we look at the human movement system solution to the respective problem, we got to talk about degrees of freedom at the perceptual and cognitive level as well. All of a sudden we see this huge toolbox, which a huge problem that's constantly changing and constantly evolving. And what is that player's understanding of himself or herself in time and space in respect to it? So wonderful question. And again, a topic that I think we haven't even begun to open the can of worms on enough, that we all need to start having dialogue around.
It reminds me of a play earlier this year. I think it was Shawn Barkley from Penn State. He was running up and he saw a shadow of the defender and ran away from the shadow. They asked him, they asked him after the game. He's like, I just saw the shadow and ran away from the shadow. Talk about perception, using your senses. That's incredible. But like you talked about, I'd like to go on this a little bit, that fine line of, asking a question of what they felt, what they thought, when can that become too far? Because, you ask other people too, what's the best way to, like you said, physically constrain somebody? Say you're playing a game of basketball or golf, and tell them, hey, your backswing looks really nice. And then they overly analyze, get past the analysis, and and then they shank the next 10 shots because now they're overly focused instead of letting some of that movement just naturally flow, kind of unconscious or subconscious, if you would. What's that fine line? I know there's no right answer for that, but, when can you push too far and when's, the right amount of digging?
Yeah, I think that's such a wonderful question, which is obviously multifaceted, again, as all of these are when it revolves around the complexity or complex systems that are involved with this integration of a movement solution. But I think what you're really hitting on here, Michael, is that obviously that whole idea of constrained action or maybe the choking and effects of pressure and anxiety that can happen, even on a really small level there, if we give them too much explicit or intrinsic information to focus on. Of course, again, it's a depends type of thing, unfortunately, like you made the mention in your answer, but I think some rules kind of apply. I think more often than not, we should attempt to try to make it and say less rather than more, first and foremost, whether that's in regards to our instructions or our feedback, or whether it's in regards to maybe what an individual is doing wrong in our perception. To give them conscious information, the more conscious it becomes, often what you made the mention to there, the more it will break down because they will constrain that action that they normally allow to become a self-organized movement pattern. And of course, that's the whole idea with dynamical systems, right? We're going to get an emergence of a self-organized movement behavior in the dynamics of it that are going to be related to it if we allow that individual to kind of just flow within that problem. But again, it kind of speaks to knowing when to say when, because if we see this compensation emerging, maybe it's knee valgus, or maybe they're, if we go back to that vision answer, they're not looking at the right thing at the right time in order to be able to solve that problem. And all of a sudden they get ear hold and they get depleted because of it. Like, that's a time where we might have to explicitly tell them a little bit more rather than just try to guide and facilitate. You see what I'm saying? So it's an it depends type of situation. Like if my player's just out there kind of like, lackadaisically going through the motions because they think they're going to organize a movement behavior that's going to be an optimal one. Just because it's emergent, there might be times that I have to step in. But again, say less rather than more, and realize that, information in our attention is such a vital resource. So you don't want to waste it. You don't want to waste it with, additional words. You don't want to waste it with additional thoughts. You want to say just enough. And, again, and if ever in doubt, say less rather than more. But I think some of it there, gentlemen, is that it's determined by, the sports skill that we're talking about, the level of mastery within that skill, how acquired and developed it is at that point, maybe what that individual has been exposed to in the past. I mean, it becomes such a messy thing that's where the art of coaching, and I know Shawn Larkin from the skill acquisition coordinator from the Dodgers kept saying it in our little, meeting too, that's kind of the art of coaching there. You just need to expose yourself to these things and realize that as a movement skill acquisition specialist or a movement skill acquisition coach or facilitator, you're going to facilitate the wrong thing sometimes. And that you just got to know when to say when. And, Korey and I have had this conversation on many occasions as well, where it's really easy to beat ourselves up about it when, we can see that we might have said too much and given them too much explicit information, or then they started to intrinsically focus, Michael, like you said, on maybe their backswing or the nuances of it. But then you just got to back off a little bit and maybe make it a little bit more implicitly driven. Just say, well, don't listen to anything I just said. Let's try something else.
Well, that also gets at, you got to know your athletes too. Like that, the better I know, I think if I remember right, the situation where you're talking about, that guy was like an incoming freshman. I didn't know him very well. And I think there's just times where if you know how athletes work and what makes them tick, and some athletes might do better with explicit information and other athletes just won't. So that's part of it too, right?
We freeze here?
Oh, I think we're frozen. Oh, no, maybe not. Shawn's just really still.
He might be frozen, yeah.
I'm frozen. Can you hear us, Shawn? Uh-oh, yep.
Sometimes people think there's, a lot worse things that could happen to me. So,
oh, shit. You know what? I think that's a good place to wrap up. I got to get my so.
Even Zoom is like, oh my gosh, these guys won't stop.
They should have been there present in Mesa, Arizona a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, Korey, Shawn, thanks for coming on, guys. Well, like I said, we have, we probably get on again, do this again sometime, because I know Korey's got some more questions. Same here. And Shawn, I know you love talking about this and spreading the good word. So we'll have to set up another time, guys. But appreciate you. I mean, it's already going on an hour and a half right now. But Shawn, Korey, anything else you guys want to say? But I just want to say I want to thank you guys right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess on my end, I appreciate obviously the dialogue and obviously any and more that our industries and our profession can kind of continue to come together, attempt to evolve the thoughts and concepts and principles collectively, I think is going to be the biggest thing. We got to start having conversations around this and embrace the complexity of sport movement rather than, disregard it or try to control it too much. So I thank you for that opportunity. And obviously it's always a pleasure to talk to both of you gentlemen.
Absolutely. Great stuff, guys.
All right, guys. Well, you guys have a good afternoon, huh?
Yep, you too.
Yeah, you too, guys.
We'll see ya.
Join me in thanking Korey and Shawn today for this great discussion. I hope you guys learned something and had a little insight to what we took away from the skill acquisition in Arizona meeting. A lot of good concepts thrown around, a lot of good ideas and ways for coaches and practitioners to make their training and practice more representative and have greater transfer and retention for our athletes. So thanks to those two again. And until we see you guys next time on the Elite Performance Podcast.